She had always liked the quiet mornings in her neighborhood. The sun would rise slowly, painting the streets in soft golden light, and the air would carry the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. She would step outside with a cup of coffee, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, and breathe in the calmness. For years, this neighborhood had been her safe space. She had worked hard to make her house a home. The garden in front of the house was her pride. Neatly trimmed hedges framed the walkway, and colorful flowers nodded gently in the breeze. Every detail mattered to her. Every corner of her home reflected care and thought. She enjoyed seeing her neighbors pass by, waving politely, exchanging smiles. Life felt orderly, predictable, and peaceful. At first, everything was just as it should be. The streets were quiet, the neighbors friendly, and life was simple. But in a community like hers, nothing stayed quiet for long. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was the invisible hand that kept things in line. At first, it seemed harmless enough. They sent newsletters with reminders about trash days, community events, and seasonal decorations. Everyone received them, and most people didn't think much about it. She had even attended a few meetings in the past. They were polite, dry, and uneventful. Rules were mentioned, mostly about keeping lawns neat, parking rules, and small cosmetic standards for houses. Everyone seemed to follow them, including her. One morning, however, she found a letter in her mailbox that made her pause. The envelope was plain, official-looking, and carried the HOA logo. She opened it carefully, expecting perhaps a newsletter or a reminder. But what she found made her stomach sink. The letter stated that her lawn had grown taller than the allowed limit, and she was being fined. She blinked, thinking it must be a mistake. She had trimmed the lawn herself just a few days ago. She had spent hours making sure it looked neat, shaping the edges carefully, and making the flower beds tidy. How could it possibly be a violation? She checked the measurements mentioned in the letter. They didn't match what she had measured herself. Still, she tried to remain calm. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. She made a note to call the HOA office later that day. The first call was polite. She explained her side, mentioned the measurements, and asked for clarification. The person on the other end sounded scripted. Our inspectors have reviewed your property, and the rules were violated. The fine stands. You may appeal in writing. That simple sentence sparked the first flicker of frustration. She had always believed in reason, in communication, in solving problems without conflict, but this response felt cold, impersonal, and unfair. She ended the call, feeling a mix of disbelief and irritation. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. Some were small reminders, almost trivial. Others were new finds. One noted that a garden decoration she had placed, a small wooden birdhouse, was not approved. Another mentioned the color of her door, which, according to the HOA's records, was off by half a shade from the approved palette. Each notice felt increasingly absurd. She began to see a pattern. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were targeting minor details that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And yet, she felt trapped. These letters were official and paying fines, no matter how small. Felt like admitting wrongdoing. She started observing her neighbors more closely. Some had lawns slightly longer than hers. Some had decorations that were far more creative than what the HOA allowed, yet they never received letters. Why her? Why now? The inconsistency puzzled her. It felt personal. At night, she would lie awake, thinking about how much effort she put into her home, only to be met with these petty punishments. She couldn't understand why she was being singled out. The sense of injustice gnawed at her. It wasn't just about a lawn or a birdhouse. It was about respect, fairness, and dignity. Despite her frustration, she didn't act rashly. She spent hours reading the HOA bylaws, comparing them to the letters she received. She found vague language, loopholes, and contradictions. Some rules were clear. Others were written in such a way that interpretation was entirely subjective. She realized that the HOA had immense power over homeowners, especially those who didn't challenge them. Many people would simply pay the fines, frustrated but silent. She had never liked confrontation, but this situation forced her to think differently. It was no longer just about a lawn. It was about standing up for herself. Her first formal appeal letter was careful and detailed. She cited specific measurements, rules from the HOA documents, and even photographs of her property. She explained her side calmly, politely, and logically. The reply she received was brief. Your appeal has been reviewed and denied. No explanation, no acknowledgement of her evidence. She felt a spark of anger. She had tried reason, courtesy, and patience. It hadn't worked. Her thoughts began to shift from frustration to determination. If the HOA thought she would simply comply, they were mistaken. She began keeping meticulous records of every interaction, every letter, and every violation notice. She photographed her lawn weekly, documented the placement of decorations, and even noted conversations with neighbors about similar issues. She was building evidence, quietly but steadily. Every step felt empowering. For the first time, she felt that she could fight back in a way that mattered. At the same time, she had to maintain appearances. To the casual observer, she was still the quiet homeowner with a neat garden. She smiled at neighbors, exchanged pleasantries, and continued her daily routines. But beneath that calm surface, she was planning her next moves carefully. She realized that patience and preparation could be more powerful than anger or confrontation. She also realized that this fight wasn't just about herself. Other neighbors might be silently struggling with similar unfair treatment. She began considering the possibility of quietly rallying support without attracting attention. Life in the neighborhood continued as usual. Morning coffees on the porch, brief chats with passing neighbors, and small joys like watching the flowers bloom remained part of her routine. But the HOA letters became a reminder that nothing in this quiet life was guaranteed. Every envelope carried tension, every phone call required vigilance. And yet, there was a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer just a homeowner following rules. She was someone who was learning to navigate an unfair system and to stand her ground without losing her composure. The early mornings became her thinking time. As she walked through her garden, notebook in hand, she reflected on her options. She weighed every decision, considered every possible outcome. She read stories of other homeowners who had taken on similar associations, learning from both successes and failures. The process was slow, meticulous, and sometimes exhausting. But with each passing week, her confidence grew. She realized that she didn't need to fight blindly. Knowledge, preparation, and persistence were her allies. Neighbors began noticing small changes in her approach. She started attending HOA meetings more regularly, asking questions politely but firmly. Some members of the board seemed irritated, others surprised. They were accustomed to passive homeowners, and she was not one. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. She could sense the small cracks forming in the facade of control that the HOA maintained. They still held power, but they were no longer untouchable. Her personal life continued amidst this growing conflict. She spent evenings reading, gardening, and occasionally taking walks in the nearby park. Friends noticed her quiet intensity, her determination, and occasionally teased her about being too serious. But they also saw the spark in her eyes, the fire of someone who had decided that unfair treatment would not go unchallenged. This was not about conflict for the sake of conflict. It was about dignity, fairness, asserting one's rights in a respectful but firm manner. One afternoon, as she sipped her coffee and looked over her garden, a letter arrived. This time, it was not a fine, but a notice about a minor complaint regarding the placement of her new garden bench. She smiled quietly, almost to herself. The HOA thought they could intimidate her with trivial issues, but she had already begun preparing for larger challenges. Each small attempt by the HOA only strengthened her resolve. It was becoming clear that this was not going to be a simple fight, and she was ready to see it through, step by step. With careful planning and unwavering persistence, by the end of the first part of this journey, she had learned a valuable lesson. Standing up to authority didn't have to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes it could be quiet, patient, and methodical. And as she looked around her garden, feeling the soft breeze and hearing the distant laughter of children playing in the neighborhood, she felt a quiet sense of anticipation. This was only the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, frustrating, and unpredictable, but she was ready. She would not just endure. She would act carefully and deliberately until fairness was restored and her voice was heard. And so, in the calm of her early morning, with the sunlight warming her face and the scent of flowers in the air, she made a silent promise to herself. She would take on the HOA, and they would never see it coming. The days that followed felt heavier. Each morning she walked past her mailbox with a sense of unease, wondering what the HOA would send next. Every envelope felt like a small test of patience, a subtle reminder that her peaceful life was no longer as quiet as it once had been. The fines and letters had not stopped. If anything, they had grown more frequent and, in her view, more absurd. One morning, she found a note slipped under her door. It said that her driveway had not been washed properly. She stared at it for a long time, incredulous. She had spent an entire afternoon scrubbing it, carefully sweeping away every speck of dust and dirt. It was spotless. She felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. The note was signed by one of the board members. It carried the thinly veiled tone of authority that was meant to make homeowners feel small. But she had learned not to respond in anger. That never worked with the HOA. They thrived on confrontation, counting on homeowners to react emotionally so they could dismiss complaints or claim defiance. She had to remain calm. She had to be smarter. She walked over to her driveway again, inspecting every corner. Nothing was out of place. Not a single crack or stain. She even took photos, documenting her work meticulously. This time, she resolved that she would not just respond. She would respond with proof. The first few neighbors she spoke to were sympathetic but hesitant. Some nodded quietly when she told them about the letters and fines. One neighbor whispered that she had been fined twice the previous year for having the wrong color mulch, but she had paid without complaint. Another mentioned that the HOA seemed to target homeowners who asked questions. She realized that many people simply lived in fear of the association, accepting whatever came their way because they believed resistance was useless. That thought made her more determined. She did not want to live in fear. She wanted fairness, not just for herself, but for everyone in the neighborhood. She began spending more time at the computer, reading HOA bylaws carefully, line by line. The rules, she noticed, were written with vague language that allowed for endless interpretation. Words like reasonable and appropriate were used constantly, without definition. One clause mentioned that all exterior decorations must be in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic. But there was no description of what qualified as acceptable. That left a huge gap for arbitrary enforcement. She realized that the HOA could and did define the rules however it pleased. But that did not mean she had to accept it quietly, to strengthen her position. She started collecting evidence of what other homeowners were doing. She walked her dog around the neighborhood in the evenings, taking notes discreetly. She observed lawns, decorations, and paint colors, noting who had received letters and who had not. Patterns began to emerge. Certain families seemed untouchable, even when their homes clearly did not meet the rules. Others, like herself, were under constant scrutiny. The unfairness became increasingly clear. It was not about the rules at all. It was about power and control. The HOA wanted to assert dominance. She was learning that the only way to challenge it was through preparation and proof. At the same time, the letters continued to arrive. One morning, she found a notice complaining about the height of the fence behind her garden. She had built it herself, following the HOA's guidelines from 2 years ago. Now, suddenly, it was too high by a few inches. The letter demanded immediate correction and threatened additional fines. She felt a flash of anger, but she breathed deeply and reminded herself that anger would not solve anything. Instead, she measured the fence carefully, took photos, and even found the old approval paperwork from the HOA archives. She had everything she needed to prove her case. Her evenings became occupied with meticulous organization. She created a folder for each violation notice, each appeal letter, and each piece of evidence. Photographs were labeled with dates. Notes about conversations were recorded with exact times and words spoken. She even started maintaining a spreadsheet to track fines, appeals, and responses from the HOA. It was methodical work, but she found a strange satisfaction in it. For the first time, the imbalance of power began to feel less intimidating. She was no longer relying on memory or verbal arguments. She had facts, proof, and a strategy. Occasionally, she reached out to a few neighbors for quiet support. Some were cautious, afraid of attracting the HOA's attention, but a few were willing to share their experiences. They exchanged stories of fines for trivial matters, a slightly crooked mailbox, seasonal wreath deemed inappropriate, or a car parked just a few inches outside the lines. It became clear that she was not alone. Many homeowners had been silently struggling with the same unreasonable demands, but fear had kept them from acting. She realized that community could be a source of strength, even if it had to be nurtured carefully. The HOA, of course, remained oblivious to her growing plan. They continued sending letters as if nothing had changed. One afternoon, she received a notice stating that her garden path stones were not aligned to standard and needed adjustment. She examined the stones and found that they were perfectly aligned. She even measured the angles and distances, taking photographs from multiple perspectives. Then, she wrote a calm, detailed response, citing the measurements, including photos, and politely requesting the fine be dismissed. She sent it certified mail, ensuring there was a record of delivery. This was no longer just a personal fight. It had become a battle of documentation and careful strategy. As she waited for responses, she continued observing the HOA's methods. Meetings she attended revealed subtle favoritism, where certain homeowners were allowed more leeway, while others faced stricter scrutiny. The discussions were polite but biased. She noticed that some board members seemed to enjoy their power, making decisions with minimal oversight. It was frustrating but also illuminating. She understood that to win, she would need patience, persistence, and precision. She could not rely on emotion or confrontation. She needed rules, evidence, and strategy. Meanwhile, the personal toll of this fight became apparent. Friends and family sometimes worried about how much time she was dedicating to the HOA issue. They saw her intensity, the meticulous notes, and the hours spent measuring and documenting. Some worried she was becoming consumed, but she reassured them quietly. This was not about obsession. It was about justice and dignity. She was learning that standing up for herself required focus, care, and patience. Every step was deliberate, and she refused to allow frustration to dictate her actions. The HOA letters continued to arrive like clockwork. One morning, a new notice complained that her mailbox post was slightly crooked, threatening a fine. She measured it. It was perfectly straight. The letter felt absurd, but she took it seriously. She photographed the mailbox from every angle, compared it to neighboring posts, and even found the original approval form from when the mailbox was installed. This evidence would be part of her growing FILA record that would eventually tell a story of unfair treatment, bias, and meticulous injustice. During this time, she also learned to master patience and communication. Calls to the HOA office were brief and polite. Emails were structured, clear, and formal. She learned to phrase questions carefully, avoiding words that could be interpreted as aggressive or hostile. She discovered that calm persistence could be more effective than anger. While the board continued to enforce their rules aggressively, she was quietly building the foundations for a stronger position. Each interaction, each response, and each letter was another piece of her growing strategy. Evenings spent in her garden became meditative. She would sit quietly among the flowers, reflecting on the week's letters, fines, and observations. She found clarity in the quiet, planning her next steps without haste. She realized that power was not only about authority, but also about knowledge, patience, and preparation. And slowly, she felt her confidence growing. What had once felt like an oppressive force now seemed less intimidating. The HOA may have had rules, but she had facts, evidence, and a growing understanding of the system. Her growing collection of neighbors' stories became increasingly useful. She quietly recorded instances where similar violations had been ignored for others. This comparison highlighted the selective enforcement of rules, strengthening her argument that fines were not applied equally. She realized that the fight was bigger than her lawn, her mailbox, or her garden stones. It was about fairness, equality, and accountability. She began to see a pattern. Those who dared to question were targeted, while those who remained silent were left alone. This insight gave her clarity and purpose. One afternoon, walking through the neighborhood with her notebook, she noticed a few neighbors whispering and glancing in her direction. Some nodded subtly as she passed, and she sensed that awareness of her quiet determination was spreading. They may not have spoken openly, but the message was clear. She was paying attention, documenting everything, and refusing to accept arbitrary fines. That quiet recognition fueled her resolve. She was not just challenging the HOA for herself, she was setting an example, showing that careful, thoughtful resistance was possible. The weeks turned into months, and the letters continued. Each one was another chance to document, strategize, and learn. She remained calm and deliberate, never letting the frustration show in her words or actions. And though the HOA remained unaware of the storm quietly building beneath her composed exterior, she knew it was only a matter of time before her careful preparation would come into play. She was no longer a passive homeowner. She had become a strategist, a planner, and an observer. She had transformed frustration into purpose, patience into power. By the end of this stage, she had learned something essential. Facing an unfair system required more than emotion or anger. It required knowledge, evidence, and strategy. She understood the rules, documented every detail, and quietly built a case that would be hard to ignore. The HOA continued to operate under the assumption that homeowners would comply, but she was no longer one of them. She was ready to take the next steps, to confront injustice, not with rash words, but with careful planning and undeniable evidence. And so, with the neighborhood around her continuing its quiet rhythm, she sat on her porch one evening, notebook in hand, thinking about the letters, the fines, and the small injustices she had endured. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. She smiled softly, feeling the first stirrings of confidence and purpose. She knew the road ahead would be challenging. The HOA had power, and they were used to controlling every detail. But she had something they underestimated: patience, preparation, and the determination to see fairness restored. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. The next chapter of this quiet war had begun. The first cracks in the calm of the neighborhood began to show, as she quietly moved from reaction to preparation. Every morning, as she sipped her coffee and looked out over her garden, she thought about the letters that had piled up over the past months. They were no longer just annoyances, they had become pieces of a larger puzzle. She realized that the Oz power was built not only on rules, but also on the compliance of homeowners. If she could show that the rules were being applied unfairly, she could challenge them in a way that mattered. The thought was both exciting and daunting. She had never done anything like this before, but she felt a strange thrill in knowing that she was finally taking control. Her strategy began with organization. She spent entire evenings creating a detailed log of every interaction with the HOA. Each letter, each email, and each phone call was recorded with dates, times, and the names of people she had spoken to. She printed copies of photos showing her lawns, fences, driveways, and mailbox posts at the time of inspection. She even measured things multiple times to ensure absolute accuracy. Every minor detail was accounted for. In her mind, these details were not just about fines or rules, they were evidence that would make her argument undeniable. Once her documentation began to take shape, she turned her attention to the bylaws themselves. She read them with a meticulous eye, highlighting vague language, ambiguous phrases, and contradictions. One clause mentioned that exterior decorations must be in harmony with the neighborhood's aesthetic, but there was no definition of what that meant. Another stated that lawns must be maintained to reasonable standards, but the definition of reasonable was left entirely to the inspector's discretion. She realized that these ambiguities were where the HOA's real power came from. They allowed them to issue fines almost at will. But she also realized that this vagueness could work in her favor if she pointed it out carefully and logically to further strengthen her position. She began speaking discreetly with a few neighbors who had also experienced unfair treatment. Many had quietly endured similar fines, but had been too intimidated to challenge them. Some had even paid double or triple fines over the years without question. She listened patiently as they shared their experiences, noting patterns and inconsistencies. Some neighbors had received warnings for things she had never been questioned about, while others had clear violations that went unmentioned. Slowly, she began to see a pattern of selective enforcement, favoritism, and oversight. This information became part of the quiet strategy she was building. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their routine. Letters arrived with frightening regularity, each one more trivial than the last. One letter complained that the corner of her fence leaned slightly to the right. Another, that her mailbox had a faint chip in the paint. Each letter was carefully recorded, measured, and photographed. She responded to each one politely, with clear evidence showing that there was no violation. The HOA continued to deny her appeals, as expected, but she remained calm, knowing that every denial, every threat, and every dismissive response was strengthening her eventual case. As the weeks passed, she realized that winning this battle would require more than evidence. It would require allies. She began quietly building relationships with neighbors who had been silently affected by the HOA's strict enforcement. Not everyone was willing to speak out, but even small gestures shared stories. Nods of understanding, discreet confirmations of similar treatment gave her confidence. These neighbors became part of an informal network of support. She was careful not to draw attention. She did not want the HOA to sense the growing resistance. Every conversation, every plan, was handled with discretion. She also started attending HOA meetings more regularly. These meetings, she observed, were designed to intimidate homeowners into compliance. Board members spoke politely, but with an air of authority that left little room for debate. Homeowners who questioned fines or rules were often met with dismissive comments or subtle threats of additional penalties. She realized that confrontation alone would not win the day. She needed strategy, patience, and careful timing. She would not attack blindly. She would move deliberately, methodically, with proof that could not be denied. One evening, she decided to take a careful survey of her own property. She measured fences, checked the angle of her mailbox, examined the height of every bush, and documented everything with photographs. She even created a simple diagram of her property, marking every element that could be questioned by the HOA. Every inch of her home was now accounted for, leaving no room for arbitrary claims. This level of preparation was exhausting but empowering. She began to feel a quiet confidence that she had never felt before. She was no longer just reacting. She was anticipating. Her research into HOA bylaws uncovered an interesting detail. Many of the rules cited in fines were outdated or not formally approved. Some references pointed to guidelines that had been revised or removed entirely. This was a small but significant discovery. If she could prove that the fines were based on improper rules, she could challenge the validity of the penalties themselves. This became a cornerstone of her emerging plan. She realized that knowledge was her most powerful tool. With every detail she uncovered, she became less afraid and more determined. In addition to research, she spent time observing the enforcement patterns of the HOA. Some families were clearly treated differently, often because they were quiet or less likely to question authority. Others, like herself, were targeted repeatedly for minor infractions. She began mapping these patterns, noting the names of board members who were involved, the dates of inspections, and the exact language used in letters. It was becoming a game of strategy, and she approached it with precision. She knew that when the time came, she could present a case that would be hard for anyone to dismiss, even as she worked on her strategy. Life in the neighborhood continued. Morning walks, friendly greetings from neighbors, and the quiet hum of daily life persisted. To an outsider, she appeared calm, orderly, and unaffected. But beneath that calm surface, she was building a quiet storm. Her garden remained immaculate, her home perfectly maintained, and her demeanor friendly and composed. She understood that appearances mattered. If the HOA sensed anger or recklessness, it would weaken her position. Patience, she realized, was her secret weapon. Her interactions with neighbors became more purposeful. She began asking discreet questions about their experiences, learning which violations were enforced and which were ignored. Some neighbors were hesitant, but a few were willing to share quietly. She collected stories of fines for crooked fences, mismatched paint, or improperly trimmed lawns. These accounts, combined with her own meticulous records, began to form a compelling narrative. The HOA was not enforcing rules fairly or consistently. This evidence, she knew, could be critical when she eventually confronted the board. She also took care to strengthen her personal resolve. The constant stress of letters, fines, and unfair treatment could have been overwhelming, but she found ways to maintain perspective. Gardening, early morning walks, and quiet evenings with a book became rituals that helped her stay grounded. She reminded herself constantly that this was not just a fight for herself, but a fight for fairness and dignity. Every small action, every letter carefully written, and every photo taken was part of a larger, deliberate plan. The turning point in her preparation came when she realized that the HOA had underestimated her determination. They assumed she would comply, pay fines, and accept minor injustices without question. But she had moved beyond compliance. She had documented every violation, researched every rule, and gathered evidence of selective enforcement. She had allies, even if they were quiet, and she had a plan forming in her mind. The HOA had no idea that she was no longer a passive homeowner. They were about to face someone who was prepared, patient, and strategic. One afternoon, she received yet another letter, this time claiming that her garden path was not aligned to standard. She measured it carefully and found it perfectly aligned as she had documented weeks earlier. She smiled quietly, recognizing the pattern of harassment. Instead of feeling frustrated, she felt validation she was right to trust her evidence and preparation. She drafted a detailed response, including photos, measurements, and references to the original approval documents. She sent it with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Knowing that her careful work would speak louder than any argument, at night she reflected on how much she had learned. The fight was no longer about anger or emotion. It was about strategy, patience, and clarity. Every letter, every fine, and every denial had taught her more about the system, about human behavior, and about her own resilience. She felt a growing sense of confidence. Realizing that she could face authority without fear and without losing her composure. The HOA's power was only as strong as her willingness to let it intimidate her, but she refused to be intimidated. She also began thinking about the broader implications. Other neighbors were quietly suffering under the same system, afraid to speak out. If she succeeded, it could open the door for change, for fairness, for accountability. This thought gave her purpose beyond herself. Her meticulous preparation, careful documentation, and quiet strategy were no longer just a personal fight, they were a potential catalyst for the entire neighborhood. By the end of this stage, she had transformed. From a homeowner, frustrated by petty fines, she had become a strategist, an observer, and a quiet force of determination. Her preparation was nearly complete. She had evidence, allies, and a plan forming in her mind. The HOA in their arrogance remained unaware of the storm quietly building in their midst. They continued to operate under the assumption that homeowners would comply without question. But she was ready to challenge them in a way they had never anticipated as she walked through her garden one evening. Notebook in hand, she felt a calm determination settle over her. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the neighborhood streets. She smiled to herself, thinking about the letters, the fines, and the small injustices she had endured. Every detail she had documented, every observation she had made, every careful plan she had crafted brought her closer to a decisive moment. She was no longer a passive participant in the HOA's game. She was ready to take control, to act with precision, and to challenge injustice with patience and intelligence. The quiet strength she had cultivated over months of preparation would soon be tested. The HOA believed they held all the cards. Obochi had learned that power was not only in authority, was in knowledge, strategy, and perseverance. She knew the fight ahead would be challenging, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready. And when the time came, the HOA would discover that the quiet homeowner they had dismissed was not only prepared, but unstoppable. Months of preparation had led to this moment. The quiet, meticulous work she had done recording letters, photographing her property, documenting violations, and noting inconsistencies had built a solid foundation. Every late evening spent measuring fences, every call to the HOA, every conversation with neighbors, every spreadsheet carefully organized, it all had a purpose now. She knew that the confrontation she was about to face would be tense, awkward, and possibly intimidating. But she also knew that she was ready. She was no longer reacting to petty fines and letters. She had a plan, and for the first time, she felt in control. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening. Normally, she would have avoided these meetings, finding them dull and often frustrating. But this one was different. She arrived early, notebook and folder in hand, dressed neatly but comfortably. She had reviewed all the bylaws again, double-checked her photographs, and rehearsed what she would say. Her heart beat faster than usual, not from fear, but from anticipation. She was stepping into the room with quiet confidence, ready to face the people who had made her life stressful for months. As she entered, the room was already half full. Some neighbors chatted quietly, others glanced at their phones. Board members sat at a long table, looking serious and formal. She took a seat near the front, close enough to speak clearly, but not so close as to seem confrontational. The meeting began with routine items: minutes from the last meeting, financial reports, and minor announcements. Then came the part she had been waiting for, the discussion of violations and fines. Names were read aloud, violations listed, fines assigned. Her name came up multiple times. Normally, she would have felt a rush of frustration, maybe even anger. But tonight, she remained calm. She had evidence, and evidence could not be dismissed lightly. When the board called on her to respond, she stood confidently and began. She spoke clearly, calmly, and respectfully. She referenced each violation, presenting her photographs and measurements, showing that every fine issued against her had been unjustified. She pointed out inconsistencies in enforcement, highlighting cases where other homeowners with similar or worse infractions had received no fines at all. Every fact was precise, every statement backed by documentation. The room grew quiet as she laid out her case. Board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the level of preparation she had displayed. One board member, usually confident and slightly dismissive, leaned forward and asked her how she had gathered so much information. She explained briefly without revealing every detail that she had documented her property meticulously and observed the enforcement patterns of the HOA over time. She emphasized that her goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but fairness, consistency, and accountability. Her tone was firm but polite, and there was a clarity in her words that made it difficult to argue against. As she continued, she introduced her findings from conversations with neighbors who had experienced similar unfair treatment. She did not name anyone or reveal personal details. She simply presented the patterns she had observed: selective enforcement, arbitrary fines, and inconsistencies in inspections. She showed how rules were often vague and open to interpretation, allowing the HOA to impose penalties unevenly. Her argument was not emotional, it was logical, evidence-based, and carefully structured. The room shifted in response. Some neighbors leaned forward, paying attention for the first time. Board members who had previously seemed confident now appeared uncertain. One attempted to interrupt, suggesting that her complaints were exaggerated. But she responded politely, asking him to review the documentation she had provided. She maintained her calm throughout, never raising her voice, never letting frustration show. Her patience and preparation made her presence powerful. She did not need anger or confrontation. Her evidence spoke louder than any argument could. At one point, a board member tried to intimidate her, mentioning potential penalties for questioning the rules too aggressively. She smiled quietly, knowing that intimidation would not work on someone who had spent months building a case. She calmly referenced the bylaws and showed that every action she had taken was within her rights as a homeowner. She highlighted that the board itself had a responsibility to enforce rules fairly and consistently. Her words were measured, precise, and backed by documentation. The subtle threat dissolved in the face of facts. Neighbors began to whisper quietly among themselves. Some nodded in agreement as she spoke, recognizing familiar injustices. Others watched in silence, impressed by her calm authority and the clarity of her argument. For the first time, she realized the impact of her preparation. This was not just about her house or her fines. It was about demonstrating that homeowners could hold the board accountable when rules were applied unfairly. Her voice had grown beyond personal frustration. It had become a quiet force for fairness. The board members began to respond, attempting to defend their previous decisions. They cited rules, inspectors' reports, and their authority as the governing body. She listened patiently, taking notes and waiting for her moment. When it came, she carefully pointed out discrepancies between the rules they cited and the actual documentation. She showed approvals for fences, mailboxes, and paths that contradicted the fines. She highlighted cases where similar infractions had gone unpunished. Each point she made chipped away at the board's authority, not with anger, but with undeniable facts. At one point, the chairperson of the board seemed visibly frustrated. They attempted to dismiss her argument, suggesting that compliance was expected regardless of technicalities. She responded politely but firmly, emphasizing that fairness and transparency were not optional. She referenced local regulations that required consistent enforcement and accountability, making it clear that the board's arbitrary fines could have serious consequences if challenged. Her words were measured, precise, and delivered with calm confidence. The room grew quiet again, and the tension was palpable. Neighbors began to murmur approval, some quietly applauding her approach. Even those who had previously avoided speaking out began to pay attention. She realized that her careful preparation had created a moment of collective awareness. The HOA's power, which had seemed absolute, was suddenly vulnerable to reason, evidence, and patience. She continued to present her points clearly, never allowing emotion to cloud her argument. She had transformed months of frustration into a coherent, undeniable case that demanded attention. As the meeting progressed, she addressed the pattern of selective enforcement. She showed examples where other homeowners had received no fines despite clear violations. She highlighted vague language in the bylaws that allowed for inconsistent application of rules. She emphasized that accountability was not only fair, but essential for the credibility of the board. Her approach was firm, respectful, and precise. She was not attacking individuals. She was challenging a system that had been applied inconsistently and unfairly. The board struggled to respond. They had never faced someone so prepared, so calm, and so articulate. Attempts to dismiss her evidence were met with clear counterpoints supported by documentation. Each time they tried to assert authority, she calmly referenced rules, measurements, or approvals that contradicted their claims. The more they argued, the clearer it became that they were unprepared for her level of organization and precision. For the first time, their power seemed uncertain. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted dramatically. What had started as routine enforcement had become a confrontation in which the balance of power had changed. Board members who had previously been confident now appeared cautious, even defensive. Neighbors watched with a mixture of surprise and admiration. She had not raised her voice, shouted, or lost her composure. Instead, she had relied on evidence, preparation, and calm persistence. The impact was undeniable. She had shown that careful planning and patient strategy could challenge authority successfully. After the meeting, a few board members approached her quietly. They were less formal now, more cautious. Some admitted that they had underestimated her preparation and resolve. Others seemed reluctant to engage, clearly realizing that they had misjudged the situation. She responded politely, emphasizing that her goal was fairness and transparency, not personal conflict. Her calm, firm approach left a lasting impression. The board could not ignore the facts she had presented, and they were forced to reconsider their position on several fines. Even as she walked home, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The confrontation had gone exactly as she had planned. Months of preparation had culminated in a clear demonstration of her knowledge, patience, and strategic thinking. She had not only defended herself, but also highlighted the broader issue of fairness for the entire neighborhood. The letters, fines, and frustrations of the past months had transformed into tools of empowerment, and she had used them with precision that evening. She sat in her garden notebook in hand, reflecting on the events of the meeting. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. She thought about the months of preparation, the photos, measurements, logs, and conversations with neighbors. She realized that the confrontation was only the beginning. The HOA had been forced to recognize her evidence and reasoning, but there would be follow-up, adjustments, and continued observation. She was ready for that. Patience and strategy had brought her this far, and they would carry her forward. She also considered the impact on the neighborhood. Neighbors who had silently suffered under arbitrary enforcement had witnessed someone standing up effectively, calmly, and respectfully. Her example had shown that fairness and persistence could challenge authority without anger or chaos. She felt a quiet responsibility to maintain that example, to continue documenting, observing, and supporting those who might be affected in the future. Her fight was no longer just personal, it had become a quiet force for change by the end of this stage. She had learned an essential truth. Confrontation did not require aggression. Patience, preparation, and evidence could be more powerful than anger or shouting. Authority could be challenged effectively when approached with logic, clarity, and persistence. The HOA had never seen someone like her before, someone who could combine calm demeanor, meticulous preparation, and unwavering determination. She knew the fight was not over, but she had proven that she was ready to face it, and that her approach could make a real difference. As night fell over the neighborhood, she stood on her porch, looking at the quiet streets, her garden bathed in soft moonlight. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment and anticipation. The confrontation had gone exactly as planned. The HOA had been forced to acknowledge her evidence, and she had done so without losing composure or respect. She knew the coming weeks would bring responses, adjustments, and possibly new challenges, but she was ready. She had discovered a new strength within herself, a combination of patience, strategy, and calm resolve, and in that quiet moment she smiled. The HOA had never seen it coming, and they still didn't realize the full extent of the force they had awakened. She had turned frustration into power, uncertainty into preparation, and letters into tools of change. The battle was far from over, but she had proven something far more important, that fairness, persistence, and careful strategy could challenge authority and win. The quiet homeowner, underestimated for months, had finally made her voice impossible to ignore.